Before we get into our featured attraction of our discussion with composer Hans Zimmer and editor Joe Walker, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the incredible sponsors that helped to bring you this unique opportunity to visit with these two friends and incredible artists. And the first one is Massive. Just imagine this. You just received a bunch of footage from set, and you need to back up all those files to the cloud. That means you have to download everything to your desktop, only to re-upload it to storage. Wouldn't it be nice if you could instantly send those files to storage and avoid the headache? Well, with Massive, you can send and receive large files from anywhere and back them up to your preferred cloud storage with just a few clicks. Or get rid of the clicks altogether and set up automations to move files for you. Massive supports all major cloud providers, including popular media tools like Frame.io, Iconic, and Backblaze. And if you sign up for Massive today using massive.io/theroughcut, you can get 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. I'd also like to thank Extreme Music. For over 20 years, they have been providing filmmakers and artists like yourselves with the best in production audio, all created by multi-award-winning musicians and composers. Great music from the top names in the business: Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, Bear McCreary, and of course today's featured guest, Hans Zimmer. So if you want to get to know them and the music they can provide for you, just go to extrememusic.com and sign up for a free account. Once you're there, you get down to business searching for any kind of music you need. It's fun and simple to do, all online, or they can personally lend a hand from one of their many, many worldwide offices. You don't just get the finished track, you can get it in all kinds of flavors right down to the stems. So make one of the best decisions you could ever make and partner up with Extreme Music to make your story sound its very, very best. Okay, well, while you're still in sync, we'll get things rolling. Thank you both for making the time to be here today. I know we have a lot to talk about with Dune, but there's a few things I'd like to touch on first about the two of you and how you work together. Joe, the last time that Hans and I were speaking, we talked about the relationship between the film editor and the film composer, and Hans said a few things in reference to you in particular that I would love to share and hear your response. He said...
Am I going to be in trouble?
No, I'm not.
End of a friendship.
Well, we'll find out. So, and I am paraphrasing Hans, so forgive me. But Hans said this. He said, what happens is that Joe and I will start having a conversation which completely leaves out the director. So we have to be on our best behavior because we can geek out on some avant-garde or ancient music. But the advantage is that Joe understands that basically he is the drummer in my band. So Joe, what's it like being the drummer in Hans Zimmer's band, and just how do you interpret that comment?
As long as I'm not the dead one. I'm
Spinal Tap.
God, I find that very flattering. I've just got to say that the first time I met Hans was in 1988. And I was basically a dividing cell at that point, sort of just barely elevated from being a sperm. And I went round to Lily Yard, where Hans had been recording a huge string session for a climactic scene in a BBC series called Firstborn, which was Charles Dance as a religious scientist kind of maniac who creates a half man, half monkey. And this kind of rather crazy story was made emotionally tangible by Hans, I would say. And he'd just finished this huge session with all these people crammed into a tiny space. And I went round and he was showing this cue, which was a kind of Moses basket sequence with these strings going absolutely fucking bonkers. And the music was so loud that the television image was being magnetized by the speakers. And so I was kind of like an early recipient of bombastic Zimmer
Special effects. Come on. It wasn't just music. It was visual effects. I mean, it was CG effects before people made CG effects.
It was lo-fi.
Yeah, no, but Joe and I have been at it in one way or the other since 1988. By the way, the thing that he very nicely omits from that story is that I went £278 over budget, and I was told I will never work for the BBC again, and which left me with only one option, which was to go to Hollywood, when really I could have had a perfectly good BBC career. And it took Joe a few years before he decided to, and it was sort of the same thing, you just, there has been in our lives, there has been an enormous amount of Joe barging in through my door in one way or the other. I mean, there was like, probably the last time we, Matt, you and I spoke was probably about Blade Runner time, which was Joe phoning me up and going, hey, can you help us out a little bit? And me going, you must be joking. I'm going on tour tomorrow. And I promise you, I put the phone down and the door gets pushed open. And it's Joe and Denis just barging into the room. And, the rest is, I went on tour and then I had 10 days off, which wasn't a time off. It was the hardest I ever worked.
You literally had luggage. I remember you had luggage in the studio. You were. Well, no, it's just, it's quite a few collaborations. The very first thing I did in Hollywood was 12 Years a Slave. And, me and Steve, came and sat with you, Hans. And I remember a conversation where you said, look, we were worried because I think our producers had told us that we just basically couldn't afford to work with you and to get it out of our tiny minds. And I remember you saying, well, for you, $1. Have you got $1? And me and Steve were like, so I'm really sorry, Hans, I owe you. I don't know what the inflation is. Thank God it wasn't Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's bad. There's an interesting element here, and so for that people with, I think, similar sensibilities keep finding each other in this crazy universe of storytelling, this crazy universe of making movies, and it doesn't matter if we're making things at the BBC or we're working with Steve McQueen or. It's like, and it's not the convenience of shorthand. Joe, you correct me if I'm wrong. It's quite the opposite. It's that we know that we can push each other that we have the confidence to go and really push each other to sort of leave any comfort zone that might have existed. And let's face it, when any movie you work on, there is no comfort zone because I don't know. I've done a few hundred, no, not a few hundred, but I've done way over 100 movies, and it's still always the same thing. It's just terrifying. You say yes, and as soon as you say yes with great enthusiasm, then the next moment is, oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? How am I going to get anything done? And Joe must feel the same way. I mean, we're basically the prime human example of a bumblebee, where we have these tiny wings and this huge body of movie to carry with no time, and the whatever the budget is, it's always wrong, right? So and the other thing we have, and I think I'm speaking for both Joe and me, and I don't want it to be pretentious, so Joe can just deny it. We have the ambition of art, which is always there. We're trying to do something that maybe, just maybe, is going to go and advance the art forward a little bit.
I think it's interesting that, part of this is, that you end up properly collaborating. And when I say collaborating, it means, Hans and Denny and I and other people that we've grouped around ourselves are kind of, there's a true collaboration in the sense that we don't necessarily have to talk about music together.
But we don't. We actually don't.
In fact, it's better. I'd rather leave, discussion of modulation to you and your team.
You did say on Dune, you said, maybe we can just move away from D minor for just a little bit here. No, I do remember. Yeah, no, but hang on. But let me bring up a really contentious subject, which I have been thinking a lot about, in very much in relationship between what you and I do and what happened on Dune, which was, we set out to make a movie. For the big screen, big cinematic movie for a huge big screen, and Denis was shooting it like this. The actors were acting in a big movie. Joe was cutting a big movie. I was obviously relying on big speakers, etc. And then suddenly we sort of heard that, oh, well, maybe this is going to go day and date to HBO Max, which really made me think, because I don't mind. I mean, I don't mind streaming. I love television. I love things streaming. I love looking at things on my iPad, etc. But I would approach everything differently, because, and I think Joe would too, because the thing that happens when you look at cinema, when you look at a big screen, and especially with the way Joe cuts, and I'm saying this as somebody who has studied his art, time and time again. The eye takes a long time to wander over the surface of an enormous screen, while if you're cutting something for an iPad or for television or whatever, the eye takes everything in. But the way Joe cuts, as far as I'm concerned, and he can say that I'm just misreading him, is that within the frame, within the large frame, there is another story. There's a story being told in a horizontal sort of way, and in a vertical way, and then in a way where time passes, where the film actually moves forward. But you stay on a shot for a longer time, because you know that the story that the eye needs to catch on a large screen will take you a little longer, but it's more of an experience. It's more intense, and the same goes for me. I mean, I go and I would limit my whole base range if I knew we were going to go and do this because I've had this experience. I mean, Dark Knight, they wanted to release the soundtrack on vinyl, and they kept sending it back to us going, there's a 20-second gap in the music. And I kept going, no, there isn't. And this happened like 4 times or something like this. And then finally I realized their speakers couldn't hear. There's a track which was all down there, and they couldn't hear it. It was just rumbled. So to this day, there's still people going, oh, the 20-second gap in the music, that's a very interesting artistic choice you made there. And I'm going, no, I didn't. And then the other part of the equation, of course, is that it's not just my pair of eyes that wanders across the screen when you're in the cinema. It's this shared experience that we all have, which is very different, and because of it, something happens in that shared experience where you have to allow a little bit more time. So I think one of the things I truly adore in the work of Denis and Joe is the rhythms they use. But the rhythms are the rhythms of cinema. They're not the rhythms of television.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the rhythms, Hans, because you went on to say about Mr. Walker, all good editors I've worked with truly have a gift of rhythm and courage. 12 Years a Slave, I mean, the courage of that movie of just holding onto a shot, that's Joe. Because every director is a little insecure. We're all a little insecure. But part of it is that the editor is the person that says to you, it's okay, you could hold on to that note, or you could hold on to that shot. You don't need any music here. It's okay. The silence is great. So Joe, being as courageous as you are, I will ask you, is there a natural tendency for most editors to overcut or to use music given to you by a great composer or shots from a brilliant cinematographer to lean towards, using more ingredients than the recipe really calls for, even though, those elements don't necessarily move the story forward?
Courage only gets amplified with a bigger film, because trying to convince, a lot of films that are low budget films, should we say, from many studios, it's a question of throwing, several $1 million over a wall and not really caring what happens. If they get some critical appraisal out of it, then that's great. If they establish a relationship with a director and his team, then that's also great. But there isn't an expectation for it to have stickiness as an idea and to have success as a story and to be able to kind of reach many, many people and become a kind of commercially viable project. So it becomes harder. And, in Dune, there's examples everywhere where it takes not just courage, which is very flattering that you say that, but I think it's also tricks to try and keep people's tension, because for me, I'm looking for a suspense that you only get by holding off from cutting sometimes. I mean, if you are just cutting constantly, robotically, and squandering shots and changing the point of view, you're kind of, the sharpness of your blade has become dull as an editor. And, I'll give you a practical example of that, which is when Stilgar comes into the court for the first time. There's a story tension, which is made explicit in dialogue, which is that the Fremen are dangerous and unreliable. They don't make natural bedfellows in any war. They've been fighting for their own preservation for many years in this story. So when he comes into court, he barges in. He doesn't stop on command. He walks all the way up to the Duke's table. He stands there and looks at them with a deep contempt, and then spits on the table. Now, when you've got Timothée Chalamet, Steve McKinley-Henson, Josh Brolin, Oscar Isaacs, Jason Momoa, and Javier Bardem, but all of those first people, all of those actors were doing something magnificent at that moment. There's, 6 places where you could have gone that could have built the tension. But our feeling was when we were cutting it, is if you hold on to that, there's tension. And that spit is really aggressive. And then you can follow it. You landscape it in some way so that things are kind of fast before it and fast after the event. And that's in a sort of microcosmic way what we did in 12 Years, when we have a long shot where he's hanging, tiptoeing in the mud, Paul Solomon. And, but getting there, we compressed time and pushed the story so it was happening almost too fast. And afterwards, we didn't see him land on the floor. We just cut straight into the next scene. The next scene was him landing on the floor, and he's on the wooden floor of a Louisianan farmhouse. So it's kind of, it's a question of building that tension, and where it interfaces with music is really interesting to me, because I always kind of feel like we're striving together somehow to kind of discover a backbeat that serves both of us. There is a kind of backbeat that I feel while I'm cutting, which I think allows room for Hans's music to come in, and and we're also giving creatively as best we can, trying to avoid putting too many things in there that are didactic. So you don't, trying to carefully choose temp music, which is a kind of necessary evil, that isn't going to force him into a corner and make him, just not that you would be very easy to push into any corner, Hans, honestly, but it's, I mean, a great success for me was that harvester sequence where the worm attacks the spice harvester, and we put in an all guns blazing. We were quite pleased with ourselves that we did an all guns blazing, every single timpanist in Hollywood bashing at the back of a giant hall kind of piece. And it sort of indicated where I felt in the cut we needed to change gear or go up a level, where, okay, worm coming, those kind of beats had specific junctions, which that temp track did successfully lay down. But Hans came along and wrote a meeting, what I would describe, I'm sorry, Hans, it's awful to describe right live in front of you, but I always interpreted it as a kind of meeting with God, and a profound thing that's much, much deeper than the immediacy of their trying to escape a worm, which was all taken care of by the acting, the performance, the cutting, and the sound effects. The music gave you that massive thrill of an encounter with a kind of super being on this planet the size of a skyscraper. So, it's kind of feeling while you're cutting a sort of backbeat, and it's sort of something that I feel like gives Hans space. And then, of course, it's sitting back and watching with kind of enormous joy to the kind of different directions that he goes in.
The part in the conversation that has been left out is that Joe started out as a composer. So he actually studied music. I didn't. So that makes him, in my eyes, automatically a superior human being. But that aside,
and in mine, an inferior one. There you go.
No. But that aside, I think one of the things that we are constantly aware of, and we're trying to do that. We're working with filmmakers that are equally aware of these sort of things. That music is like, oh God, music can be like like you're hungry and you're just stuffing your face with the McDonald's. It can do that. You have a scene and the scene isn't quite working, but you slap a piece of music on and suddenly it's like everybody's going, whoa, isn't it fabulous? But if you investigate it a little further, eventually the truth will come out that it's not a very good scene, and there's no truth in it. There's no, music has a great way of being a bandage to uncommitted, not very truthful something or the other filmmaking. So that's what the temp track very often does, and so if you work with nervous directors, you're usually lumbered with a temp track. Weirdly, Joe talking about a temp track in Dune, it's only when you're talking about it that I'm going, oh yeah, I remember you had a temp track because I know what you used. But I can't actually remember where it was because I never watched the movie with the temp because I mean, I'm being hired to go and use my imagination and figure out my own journey through this whole thing, and figure out my own language through this whole thing. So as opposed to copying the temp. Plus, I want to be able to say to Joe and Denis, because we are collaborators. Therefore we are blood brothers. We are friends in this. We have to protect each other. I want to go and say, this scene isn't working, and I can go and put a Band-Aid of music on, but it's not the truth. It's not committed. There's something, Joe, go back into the shop,
Oh, there was a glorious example of that. Which I'm eternally grateful to you for, because we were quite pleased with ourselves with the way that one particular bit was cut. It was, I'm trying to say this without spoiling it for anybody, but if you imagine that at one stage, Leto met his fate, and then we cut into the desert, and then Paul and Jessica are inside a tent, and they discover the fate as well. And I remember, first of all, we've all had the discussions that, we're kind of quite personal about it. I mean, Hans, you and I are both, I think share sort of, some tragedy in early life, that is to do with the loss of a parent. And so it's a very important scene to kind of, to pay homage to and to do right, and I remember, I don't know quite how you said it. You said it very tactfully, but there was a really beautiful moment where you said you didn't think it was quite there yet, the way that we had it. And we already had embarked on writing music, and you'd already generously written the score as the pattern was planned. But I remember, me and Denny sort of, it's just really, we took that on trust that there must be another way of doing it. We found, a way of intercutting it. I think it's just infinitely better. And because it just gets those two moments together, the discovery of the ring, is at the moment, which means that you don't ask the audience to grieve twice. You ask them to grieve once, and you see the biggest emotional moment on the most important character. And it brings so much more, it meant that we substantially recut that moment and got more from Jessica and got, it was really a beautiful collaboration, that. And it's like, we're all very invested in the drama and ways, whether they be sound or music or editing or performance or, whatever it is, ways of telling it better.
Listening to you just now Joe. I mean, look, I've never had a job. I've never had a job other than what I'm doing. It was either being in a band, which is the same thing, or at the BBC with Joe or whatever. But it's always been this thing, this watching each other's back, and the passion that people invest, and the just the ability to. Okay, I've worked really hard on this, but I spent days and nights and hours and sweat and tears and blood and everything that Churchill would say on this. But for an idea that comes in the blink of an eye, that comes like for a moment of somebody else recognizing a parallel truth or something like this, I'm quite happy to go and throw it all away, and I get excited about starting again. That's what I love about filmmaking. That it's this hugely human endeavor that we're all involved in. Of trying to tell a story that ultimately, is only completed with the audience. The experience that the audience has is the final cut, the final edit, the final note, the final crossing of T's and dotting of I's. And that's pretty exciting.
Joe, you said something about giving Hans space to work. And, another editor, I think Hans and I were talking, we must have been discussing Gladiator. But Hans said something about, Pietro cutting in 4-bar increments to make it easier on Hans. Now that I know you have this formal musical training, Joe, does that ever enter in your mind when you're making edits, thinking about that?
I absolutely never do that.
No.
The idea of 4/4 is like, oh my God, no.
Actually, hang on, no. Pietro was cutting a waltz, but he was cutting it in 4-bar sections. so I could orient. Oh God, I'd spend a lifetime on that. I'd spend a lifetime on this thing. So he was the battle scene, and I was just, thank you, Pietro. That's all I can say.
It's very funny when the collaboration. Here's the deal. One of the most impressive things I saw, I had a kind of period where I was working as a composer, and I'd been working as a sound editor, then I'd broken into film editing, and then I went back to music for a while. It was because, the technology changed. It made it easier for me to do what I wanted to do. And that was an arrival, of Atari and MIDI and things like that, which we all know well, sort of kicked off, a huge impetus to the industry and creativity. And and the thing that really got me back into editing and sort of made me kind of commit was this, apart from the fact that it's fucking lonely being the composer. I mean, you really are. I just, I don't know, hats off to you, Hans. You have to kind of come into orbit and then land at just the right, at the, people who've been working together for a year on a cut, and you just skim the surface and gently land with your music right against time pressure is kind of incredible. But one of the things that really inspired me to go back to editing, and the way that, something inspired me about change, because I'd struggled a lot with kind of doing a cut that I really liked, and then some, klutz comes along and, butchers it, and you kind of go, well, that's a shame, and you have to kind of let it go, and it's a struggle for the ego, and it's all that kind of stuff. I saw this Picasso film called The Mystery of Picasso, which is just such a gem. And it's him doing his art directly on the lens of a camera.
Yeah, fantastic.
And it's just a genius film. And it shows his restlessness and the fact that, here's the deal. Working with Hans, it's so great working with Hans and Denny. It's a great, great conversation. And it allows change, to bring change into the project, because, you're influenced by the music and you're influencing the music. And the whole palette is available to all of us. It's Hans was giving us sound effects. He was giving us voices. The Sardaukar voice that starts the film is straight from.
But I kept apologizing to Theo and Mark. Yeah.
Well, but they collaborate. They work round you. There's a kind of beautiful dance between all of us. We all embrace each other's input, and it's the Picasso was just reminded me of how, with really good artists, when you're working with great artists, you elevate your game, you raise your game by bouncing off each other in this way. And in Mystery of Picasso, he draws a chicken at one point, and you go, okay, you could sell that for £1 million. It's a gem. And then he starts squiggling, and you go, don't change it. You have that horrible anxiety about changing it, and then he changes it to something just infinitely better, a centurion. And the truth is that the clever thing is knowing, what do you need, a chicken or a centurion? What is best to tell this story? But being prepared to adapt is very important, not to let go of something. And you have to work with Denny. Me and Hans know that something that was better will come back if it's not better than the next solution. He won't change things that are already working absolutely optimum for him. So, there are some scenes that just didn't change at all from the day after they filmed it. Many other scenes where we did 126 versions. But, it was like working with Hans, it's that change, the possibility of change is so effortless and beautiful working with you.
I think one of the things which is worth mentioning, which I think you know as well, Joe, that, Denis read the book when he was 13 years old. I read the book when I was 13 years old. But one of the things that was happening to Denis when he was shooting the film, that some of the scenes were exactly how he had seen them when he was 13 years old. So of course you don't change that. He struck gold a few times. You have those moments. But I think one of the things which is interesting as well is like Joe and I, we basically work in a non-verbal language. And one of the projects we start off with, Denis and Joe showed me a film, and I didn't know what to say, so I just started playing. My conversation was to literally just start playing, and they completely got what I was trying to say, and we went from there, right? And the same happens, Joe sends me a cut, and it's I can hear the actor speak, I can see the camera moves, I can see the light, I can see all that stuff. But there's that other thing as well. There's the intention and the commitment that comes from Joe's signature, Joe's language, and I don't want to say I know your style, because it constantly evolves. But there's within the cut, it is a human cutting it, a human who has an aesthetic and who has an intellectual measure of the thing, etc. So all those things come together to then inspire me to go and do whatever I do. So we're always working as extensions of each other's language, and the language isn't words.
Well, going back to Hans's comment about the editor and the composer having conversations that completely leave out those insecure directors, where does the working relationship between the film composer and film editor begin? And, using Dune as an example, what are the things that the two of you talk about?
God, I don't know. Wine. Decent glass of wine. No, it's an odd thing, what I said about insecure directors. I think both Joe and I, we absolutely see our job to celebrate our director, to celebrate their work, to bring the best out in them. And listen, I would hate to be a director. Because because I think so much of your time is being spent on trivia and minutiae of unimportant things. Just, the budget, the time, the da-da-da-da-da-da, all that stuff that, I know the producer's taking care of it, but you still feel it. But then Joe and my job is to go and focus and that is like my very, very important. My room is very important in that way. We all get together, and we're now suddenly focusing. We're shutting the door, and we're focused strictly on how we're going to go and make a good movie, and we're all in this together. I mean, I remember after 12 Years a Slave, like a month later, wandering through the halls of my studio, and there's Steve McQueen. And I'm going, why is he here? Did I forget to do something? And it was just like, he just came by, not even to talk to me, but because it was like a safe place to have ideas, And I think that's partly what Joe and I do. We create a place where it's permissible to have ideas.
There's a generosity, and I think it's all about that.
And I just want to say this, and I think Joe feels the same way. All directors we've worked with, they all get us through the trick of having brilliant ideas, of having vision, of great visions, being articulate, being daring and exciting, and wanting to take you on a great journey and a great adventure. But one of the things that Denis has, which I so adore, he leads us with unspeakable kindness. It doesn't matter how high the stress level gets. There's this humanity and kindness that we get to that we get to be part of, that we get treated with such gentleness and such respect. It's wonderful, beautiful.
It really is.
Well, Hans, you mentioned that Denis read the book, read Dune when he was a teenager. I believe you did as well. This is a story that, despite the efforts of some other talented filmmakers, has largely been considered to be very challenging to bring to the big screen. Almost like it couldn't be done.
Well, here's a weird thing. I read the book, and it sort of affected my teenage mind greatly and profoundly. And I never saw the David Lynch version. I never heard the Toto music, because I made a movie in my head at that time, and it's a television series as well. I never saw it. I never saw any of this. So it was always that version. And then, a few years back, I was going on a holiday with my son, and there was the book at the airport, and I bought it for him to read on the plane, and I never gave it to him. I opened the first page and I was back in. So here's the extraordinary, what I think is the extraordinary thing. Denis says, and I absolutely believe him, that I was the first person on board, because he very quietly one day said to me, "Have you ever heard of a book called Dune?" And I sort of told him, I read it as a teenager, a huge impression on me, etc., etc., etc. So there is that. And then the other thing was the way he said, "Have you ever heard of a book called Dune?" I knew he was making the same movie in his head that I was sort of making in my head. And I could trust him. Does that make sense? I could trust him going on that journey together for something that was very important. I mean, that Joe touched on this earlier. I mean, both Joe and I, having experienced tragedy and trauma when we were very, very young, and weirdly that whole Gom Jabbar scene, the Fierce the Mind Killer. I know it's just a science fiction book, but it's like it helped me through that whole litany helped me through periods where things were pretty gnarly in the old. I'm not sure I can go and make it through the day. it was important personally. So I came at this from a personal point of view, and I needed to work with people who I deeply loved and who I deeply trusted, and Joe and I going back to 1988 it's not a coincidence, that our paths cross like this. It's no coincidence that after I said to Joe, I was laughing, going, no, because he was going to bring Denis around, and I said, absolutely no way, I'm going on tour tomorrow, ha ha, and he flings the door open, and it became because he knew. I mean, Joe knew that the two of us would. Another interesting thing I thought just about how. Because we're talking about filmmaking, but we're talking about filmmaking that was different than anything that I've experienced. Usually, I mean, it's a room full of creative people. Somebody has an idea, and then they try to explain it, and the other person is trying to understand it, and they either go, this is good or bad or whatever. On this movie, it was always like somebody would start talking about an idea, but they never needed to finish the sentence because the other person had already grasped what that was. And so it was never a discussion. It was just a flow. It was just this river of ideas, which were, I suppose you call it being on the same page, but I think it was a lot more than being on the same page. It was things that never needed to be spoken about, which is really sort of what filmmaking, if you think about it. I mean, the best bit of filmmaking is when you don't have to explain it. It just is. It just is. It's just, and again, I mean, what Joe was saying about the editing and his editing process and the way, for instance, to hang on to a shot or to, you can't rationalize why maybe you can. Maybe you can go and talk about it. But what's the point? That's like explaining magic. It's like boring. As you're dragging it down to some sort of.
There used to be a very fruitless exercise we used to do at university, which was Schenkerian analysis, and it was this concept that you could take a Mozart symphony and reduce it to a kernel of 3 notes. And it was like all of us composers at the time, we all sort of, that was our, the thing we were interested in. We all kind of were looking at it and saying, do you think it might be like a recipe? Like you can add water to that little thing and then generate this, it just stand back while this massive thing self-inflates into, a finished piece. And it's such nonsense. You're just looking for your own particular path. And particularly because so much of what we're both doing is shaving things away from it to make it more apparent, this beautiful thing that we found, to celebrate this particular thing. And there's so many things in Dune that are kind of these objects that have a lot of love gone into them, but they also, in their creation, but also they have a lot of landscaping, if you like, to try and to help them have their place in the sort of architecture of the story. And, I can give you examples of that. I think the Worm Boy sound is one of those. That's this, how would you describe it, Hans? It's kind of like a tumbling sound, a kind of arrhythmic.
It's an arrhythmic, hey, listen, if you try to dance to that rhythm, you're going to break your legs. No, it was the idea of, of like, we have evolved, and our rhythmic sense isn't going to be disco anymore, anything like this. That rhythms can be hugely complicated, and at the same time they can be repeatable. So yeah, that plays a fair role in our game.
Loire's chant is the other one I was thinking of. That was magical.
She's magical. Yeah, she's magical. I think everybody knows by now it was during COVID, and she recorded. I have a picture. I have this very sad photo, a selfie of her recording it. She's sitting on the floor of her closet, and her coats are basically on her head, and so she's using that as her studio, and she's making the sound that reaches across the mountains and the desert, and it's just extraordinary. I mean, because I think COVID had a lot to do with how this movie turned out. I have a feeling, because especially with the singers, we all started off. Joe, Denis, everybody. We were all in the studio together, and you guys were all excited about what I was doing, etc. And then it all stopped because COVID started, and we had to move my studio into my house. Joe was cutting in your house, right? We were doing this. We were Zooming or whatever you want to call it, and it became for me. It became very, very difficult to keep a human handle on the whole thing. Because nothing, I mean, right now, I mean, look, when we start out, we know nothing is in real time anymore. We think we are looking each other in the eye, but we're not looking each other in the eye at all. I'm looking into the past.
Oh, I always feel it's a bit like being in. It's like a prison. It's like a prison visit, isn't it? It's where you're
absolutely,
forced to always, listening only through a phone, to your lover's voice.
Absolutely. So that made it really. This movie with these vast spaces, and looking at those in confinement was, psychologically quite challenging for all of us. And at the same time, it was salvation, because I could go and keep my musicians busy. My musicians who, Guthrie Govan, probably one of the, on one hand, greatest guitarists in the world. His life is being on tour or being social in the pub. That suddenly was stopped, and Guthrie was stuck at home, So giving him real purpose, giving all these musicians. This movie saved a lot of people's sanity by giving them purpose.
Isn't it a kind of strange thing that the voice is so heavily featured in this score, and yet voices at one stage, at the earliest kind of impact that COVID seemed to have was on choirs.
Absolutely.
And that it was a kind of an area where people, one heard stories about kind of choirs that met, and because they weren't wearing masks, many people infected after one, rehearsal. And I don't know if people know how much, you went to a lot of trouble. I remember that. Just, I remember doing you talking about the trailer and how long it had taken to do.
Oh, that was ridiculous.
Sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. Was something that should have taken. One of the things which I really liked is we were very respectful to people who have been sort of on this journey before. So, the trailer, Jodorowsky wanting to make Dune, and he had signed up Pink Floyd to do the music, and so we used Eclipse from Pink Floyd in the trailer, but we did a new recording, and I wanted to do it with a choir, but it was something that should have taken half an hour. It took 24 hours because I could only do 4 singers at a time. Then they had to leave. Then the place had to be cleaned. Then the next 4 singers would come in. But at the same time, I was constantly fighting the idea of social distancing. Those words I felt were like the enemy of sanity, because it wasn't about social distancing, it was about physical distancing, and it was about socially coming closer together. So one of the great things about music is it connects us. One of the great things about Joe, Denis, and my relationship, I think, and what we were doing, the movie connected us. It kept us social.
I don't want to get too pretentious, Hans, but it always felt like, Art Pepper, there's that amazing book, about his life in San Quentin jail. And he would take, he had this concept of the trip.
Yeah.
And it was like this way of painting a picture of the outside world that sort of was your escape from the kind of torments of confinement. And, you know, there was an element in which last year, I'm sure not just for us, but for many people, was in some way a kind of beautiful celebration of the connections, human connections that we weren't able to have ourselves. And I'm sure that isn't just us; it's many, many people.
Well, funny enough, before COVID, the idea for me for the movie, and Theo and Mark and you did it in another way, in another part of the movie. For me, it was a futuristic movie, right? You know, we're talking about 10,000 years from now. 10,000 years and 7 hours and 23 seconds from now, this movie takes place. So, but part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to have the DNA of everything that has gone before and everything that will be going on until we reach that point where the movie takes place, which is something you guys were doing with The Voice. But I wanted to write a score where the instruments weren't instruments of now. We built instruments. We invented instruments. We were writing software. We were creating new instruments that didn't exist. And the only thing that we maintained as a proper through line was the female voice, because we all felt that even though the story is about this boy, the story, the motor that drives the story forward is really the women. And so even when his mother isn't on the screen, Lady Jessica isn't on the screen, I still wanted to have an echo of that going on. And so the voice became hugely important to us, and it became, you know, I mean, it's part of the story is use the voice, and you guys did the same thing. You used generations of voices to make that happen. On me with the only reason I did this Sardaukar voice is because I heard something in my head and it was impossible to explain, so I had to go and do it. Do you mean? There's so much stuff that we do while we're making a film that you cannot, the words, hopefully, if you're lucky, the language doesn't exist yet to explain what it is we're doing. Now everybody's going to go, oh, Sardaukar voice, you know, and they know what that sound is. Or when I did, after I did Inception, you know, and we had those big sort of brass things, the Brahms, you know, everybody knows what a Bram is now, you know, because, every trailer is using it, not realizing for us it was a story point, and for trailers it's just a device where they're trying to sort of distract you from the bad editing. We constantly found ourselves in a situation where there wasn't a name for the thing that we were doing, and then we would do it, and now there are names for that, you know, like the bagpipes thing, which is sort of an interesting.
Oh, I love that.
I don't think even
was inspired thinking.
Oh, that was Denis. He put the bagpiper into the shot. But what I want to say is, and I don't think even you know that, that the solo bagpipe, when you're on him, the shot off him, that's not the bagpipes. That's Guthrie playing guitar. That's Guthrie doing imitating, and then all the bagpipe, and then in the middle of COVID to find 30 bagpipe players, you know. It can be done.
But it's kind of a crazy thing in Dune, though, isn't it? It's like there's I guess it sort of bears the signs of its birth in the mid-'60s, that it's a lot of political thought and environmental thinking and feminism, you know, and this concept. I mean, you know, I'm sure the women of Texas would rather envy the Bene Gesserit's ability to control their own reproduction, which is surely a kind of elevated state. And, you know, their importance in the story is very high. You know, it's, you know, the Charlotte Rampling plays the truthsayer to the Emperor himself. Baron Harkonnen, who looks like he kills anybody who comes near him, listens to her, and at least pays lip service to her advice. And I don't know, it's a very fundamental thing, but I love the way the book goes sort of forward into a possible future. I don't know who it was who said, stories are equipment for living. And so it gives you this kind of, much in the way that science fiction, I think, has got this wonderful history of showing us things that might be possible. As a kid, I watched Star Trek. I never imagined that I'd be able to hold a phone in my hand some years later. And ditto this, but it also goes in the opposite direction, back to medieval feudalism and swords and bagpipes, some ancient historic artifact. I love that.
Well, I thought partly that we could get away with it. It's first of all, if you really look, bagpipes exist all over the world. I mean, especially the Middle East. Not just from cultural imperialism from the English and the army leaving them there, but any goat herder and who has a piece of wood can make a bagpipe. And I don't think there has been radical technological development in new bagpipe technology. And one of the things I liked very much about that idea was it could be 10,000 years old and it will still be the same in 10,000 years from now. It's not like the piano or even violins, which constantly get fiddled with, technologically.
Denny always likes my joke, which is I always quote somebody who said the definition of a gentleman is somebody who knows how to play the bagpipes but doesn't.
I'm now going to give your address to the 30 bagpipe players, and they'll come round and burn your house down.
Before they riot in front of the building, those bagpipe players, I knew there was no way we were going to be able to talk about your shared history as well as Dune in an hour, but I'm grateful for the time that we did have. It's an amazing movie. The story that you two share is also amazing. I mean, we didn't even get into the career of Hans Zimmer, film editor for Terrence Malick, but we'll save that for the next interview, if you guys don't mind.
Well, no, we can do it in one sentence. Terry asked me to cut a scene. I failed so miserably. I spent a week on it. Billy Weber came, went, give me this. An hour later, came out of his room. Here, have a look at this. Had used exactly the same material as I had, made a masterpiece. I had made a complete dog's ear out of it. So I have such respect for my editor, for my editing friends.
Well, fortunately, you have Joe's number.
Yeah, I do. There you go.